Welcome everyone to this revision video on the character of Crooks in Of Mice and Men. The character of Crooks quite clearly is used to show how racist the 1930s society may have been, but also to show what it would have been like to be black during that time. Now this video is for the GCSE English Literature Unit 1 exam for the WJEC. The main purpose of this video is to show you what could turn up in the exam and to take a look at the quotations that would be really sensible to learn so that you can go into the exam feeling really confident you've got everything that you need. As a character, Crooks has turned up in the extract question. Question A will give you a page from the book, and it will ask you to either analyze how a character is presented, or how a mood and atmosphere is created, or how a relationship is presented in that extract. The character of Crooks has explicitly turned up in extracts in May 2024, in May 2017, and in May 2013. This extract turned up in 2024. The question that was asked was, how is Crooks presented here? Refer closely to the extract in your answer. The extract is when Lenny gets really angry and Crooks has to back down very quickly to protect himself. He notices the danger in Lenny, and at the end of the extract, he starts sharing a little bit about his own family and his own past, and we kind of get to see how Crooks would prefer to go back to his childhood where there was some safety, and that living in the 1930s is really hostile, and it means he wants to escape. Now, for this extract question, you would analyze the language in as much depth as you possibly can to reveal the presentation of Crooks on that deeper level. The one thing you wouldn't do in this extract question is refer to context. For the extract question, there are no marks for knowing anything about Jim Crow laws or the Great Depression. It's just your ability to analyze language and techniques. Similarly, in 2017, the extract question asked, how does John Steinbeck present the character of Crooks here? Refer closely to the extract in your answer. And the extract given is after Curly's wife's cruel attack on Crooks, and how Crooks eventually tells Candy that he was going to withdraw his offer of joining their dream, and that he never really believed in it anyway. A really horrible extract where he almost completely gives up on any hope for the future. Again, analysis of language and techniques, that's what will get you the biggest marks. And in 2013, the question read, look closely at how Crooks speaks and behaves here. What does it reveal about his character? The extract selected begins with Crooks telling Lenny how much a man needs some company. And at the end of this extract, you can see that Crooks tells Lenny that nobody ever gets to heaven and nobody ever gets any land, showing us how trapped he feels and showing us how there is no future really for the types of people we see in this novel. And the purpose of this video is not to teach you how to do the extract questions. The main focus for me is how we can write this context essay, question B or C, the question where you get to have a choice. In the context essay, it's really important you know the entire novel really well. So we're going to look at Crooks from the first mention of him and all the way up to the final thing we hear about Crooks. Because it's a context essay, what we need to do is to look at the text, look at the quotations from the text that will help reinforce the points that we'd like to make about being a black man during the 1930s, but also linking those quotations and showing us what this book shows us about the world at that time, but also what the context can tell us or reveal or illuminate about the text itself. Now, for the context essay, Crooks has turned up in the past. The last time Crook turned up in this exam was in May 2022. It was also in January 2017, and Crooks also turned up in May 2014 as a character. Now, we're going to do this exam in 2025, so we know that Crooks hasn't turned up for 2 full years. These are the questions. Steinbeck uses Crooks to show us the worst aspects of American society in the 1930s. How far do you agree? Now, whilst that question, of course, is about the character of Crooks, you'd also have to engage with the part of the question that says the worst aspects. So there's almost an expectation there for you to explain how being a black man in the 1930s perhaps was even worse than Candy's fate as an old man or as a disabled person during the 1930s, or how his pain is probably more than Curly's wife's pain being trapped on a ranch that she doesn't enjoy. The second question was show how John Steinbeck uses the character of Crooks to highlight some aspects of American society in the 1930s. For this question, quite clearly, you have to show how John Steinbeck is actually using this character. Why has he invented the character of Crooks? What is Crooks supposed to show us or to symbolize? Or how is he supposed to make us feel as a modern audience? Finally, how is the character of Crooks important to the novel as a whole? In this question, it would be really important to link Crooks perhaps into some of those themes, the themes of loneliness or isolation, or themes of powerlessness, or themes of no hope, futility. Like I said before, a thorough knowledge of all of the characters in this book will furnish you with all of the information that you need, all of the knowledge you need, all of the points and opinions you will need to tackle a number of themes that could turn up in your exam. So for example, in January 2024, this question turned up. How does John Steinbeck use characters' dreams and ambitions to show some aspects of American society in the 1930s? Personally, I would use Crooks in my essay to highlight the ambitions and dreams of some of these characters. I would probably argue in one part of my essay that Crooks does dream of a future where perhaps he would be able to be treated like a human being, as an equal to the other men on this ranch. I think his dream of equality never comes true, and I think he knows it's not going to come true in his lifetime. But his dream is to no longer be treated like an animal, to be allowed human companionship. And I think that would probably, along with another couple of characters, make up my essay. But it's not just January 2024. In 2023, 2 themes turned up, and I think Crooks would probably make it into both of these essays. The first one is, for which character in Of Mice and Men do you have the most sympathy? And if you were going to construct this essay, you might show 2 or 3 characters that you do feel sympathy for, and then perhaps give your opinion as to which one you feel most sympathy for. And I think Crooks would probably make it into that essay. I think that's the whole point of Crooks. We're supposed to sympathize with him. The theme question of 2023 was the competitiveness and brutality of American society in the 1930s are reflected in the ranch in Of Mice and Men. And I think the way Crooks is treated throughout this novella, with his constant racial abuse, and the way Curly's wife is able to completely destroy him just with a couple of words, with the threat of lynching, I think the competitiveness and brutality can definitely be seen in the character of Crooks. In January 2023, the question was, ideas about freedom are important in Of Mice and Men. How are these ideas presented in the novel? And in this essay, I could probably argue that Crooks dreams of freedom. For a moment, he thought perhaps that Candy and Lenny's dream would be his chance at freedom, before he very sadly and cynically gives up on any chance of freedom and just accepts his fate as trapped on this cruel ranch. And in May 2022, I've only gone back 2 years and you can see all of the questions that Crooks fits into. The theme was, how is the theme of injustice presented in Of Mice and Men? And I think any rational human being will see the way Crooks is treated like an animal, placed in the harness room, alone and segregated from the other men, is an injustice. And John Steinbeck uses the character of Crooks to show just how cruel the 1930s could be. So even if Crooks doesn't turn up as a single character on his own, there's a really high chance that the knowledge you get from this video and your reading of the novella, that he's going to be able to feature in one of the theme questions that is given. Now, for the full essay, the full context essay, there is an expectation that you're going to be able to link the book to 1930s context. So I've taken this mark scheme from the WJEC website to show you how essential it is that you mention some of the history that we're going to go through and we have gone through in the past. So for this question, which is Steinbeck uses Crooks to show us the worst aspects of American society in the 1930s, and it asks you how far do you agree, you'll notice the first text in bold says this question covers assessment objectives AO1, 33%, and AO4, 67%. AO1 is your knowledge of this book, your ability to make points on what happens, and to use quotations from the text to reinforce your points. Now, AO4 are marks for context. So if you do not mention anything about the Great Depression or lynch mobs or racism in the 1930s or Jim Crow laws, you are going to lose 67% of your marks. Nobody can take 67% of their marks, throw them away, and still be happy with the grade that they get at the end of it. Now, to exemplify this, if you take a look at that first band, where it says 1 to 4 marks, so a student who's going to be at the very bottom of the grade boundary, they're not going to get a grade. They will probably write something simple or generally narrative, and they will show a basic awareness of the character and the events in the novel. Now, the word narrative means retelling the story. If all you do in your essay is you just tell me who Crooks was, how he's treated by the men, and what he does or what he says, then we're not going to grade in this exam. Now, a little bit higher is the second band, so you'll get 5 to 9 marks, which won't be enough to pass. It will fall below the C grade. For 5 to 9 marks, answers will be general and narrative, with some focus on Crooks, his relationships with others on the ranch, and events which shed light on the racist attitudes which affect him. There may be some awareness of how his life reflects wider society in 1930s America, such as his segregation and exclusion from ranch life. And it's really obvious there that in order to get 5 to 9 marks, you do have to mention some history. If we just mention the history and we don't do anything with it, then we'll probably fit into the band 2 territory. But nobody is going to want to be 5 to 9 marks in this exam. If you look at band 3, which is where students who will be successful will fall, there's a little bit more for me to go through, but you'll see the levels of demand on you in this exam. A mark of 10 to 14 will be awarded for answers that maybe are still dependent on narrative, but with more detailed reference to key events and relationships, with some discussion of how the writers depict Crooks's life as a black man with low status on the ranch. These types of students will refer to violence against Crooks or the conditions he lives in, and his treatment by characters such as Curly's wife. They might be cited, with some understanding of how these aspects might be considered the worst in American society. So for a student at the bottom of band 3, they're probably going to be able to make frequent quotations from the text, and they're going to specifically show how awful Crooks's life is, and why Steinbeck might be showing us how terrible his life is. But in order to get to the top of band 3, it says for 13 to 14 marks, there will be more focused discussion on Crooks's character, his aspirations and sufferings, and how these reflect society's limitations on Black people's lives. More thorough responses will discuss the way contextual factors affect our interpretation of Crooks's behavior and actions at different points in the novel, and the way Steinbeck presents him as a victim of what was happening in the world at the time. In order for you to get 10 to 14 marks, you need to link what was happening in history to the novel, and you really need to explain why Crooks is there. Why has John Steinbeck invented him? Why does he use all of these words? Why does he make him act in a particular way? So for 10 to 14 marks, you must get history in there. And if we don't mention the history, then we're not going to fall into that band. Now, you're all going to be aspiring to be into the top band where A's and A stars may be awarded. So for 15 to 20 marks, this is what you would need to do. Answers will be evaluative and assured, showing a clear appreciation of how Steinbeck shapes our understanding of Crooks and the influence of contextual factors on him. So a student at the top of the mark scheme will really be able to show exactly what Steinbeck is doing. Answers will reveal a perceptive reading of the novel to show a considered interpretation of Steinbeck's criticism of social values. The key to this essay is to show that you understand that John Steinbeck is trying to show us something. He is not writing this book purely for entertainment. He's not writing this book for a GCSE English exam. Steinbeck wrote this essay to show us the horrific lives of Black people during the 1930s, to show us the suffering, to show us the brutality and hostility they faced, to show the unjust laws that kept people like Crooks in horrible, painful lives. He's trying to teach us something, so if you can really explain what he's trying to show us, then you'll be rewarded for that level of clarity. For 18 to 20, the analysis will be cogent, with a cohesive thread of ideas which are well supported by detailed reference to the text. The word cogent means really persuasive. You've really thought, it's very, very clear. You know what your essay is trying to do. And a cohesive thread of ideas means you've constructed your essay to take us from not knowing much about Crooks to really understanding in the conclusion exactly why Crooks has been presented in that way. That's how we're going to be really successful if it's an essay on Crooks. So now you can see just how important context is. We're going to do a quick recap of the things that are essential to put into your essay, and then we'll start looking at those key quotations that you're going to need and the types of points you can make about them and how we can link it in with what was happening at the time. Any essay on injustice or racism or Crooks in general, you're probably going to mention the Jim Crow laws. And from the pictures on your screen, you will see just how horrible it was for a Black people to be treated different to a white person. Now, in the 21st century, hopefully we no longer see these types of scenes. I think we're closer than we have been in a long time. In order to see other people as humans, I don't think we're fully there yet. But in the 1930s, there were specific laws that were created to keep Black people and white people apart. The Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation. That's an interesting phrase you might want to memorize ready for your exam. The word mandated means it was not optional. This had to happen, it was written in law. Racial segregation, the word segregation means separation, kept apart from each other. Mandated racial segregation means that it was the law that white people and black people lived in separate places. So when we see that the only black character on this ranch lives in a completely separate place to the white characters, it's because of the mandated racial segregation of the Jim Crow laws. Now, the Jim Crow laws were set up, and one of the things that they felt that it was going to achieve is that they would be able to keep black and white people separate, but also equal. Because if they are separate, there won't be racial hatred because they'll be living in different places, but they will still be equal. Now, I think we can all see the ridiculousness of that statement, but that's what those proposers would have suggested. It's best to keep everyone separate, but make sure they're equal. There were also companion laws at the time that excluded almost all African Americans from the vote. So if you were living in the South states in particular, black people were not allowed to vote. And they also deprived them of any representative government. So there was no one in government who could change this around because black people weren't elected into certain positions. Now, far from equality, as a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational, political, and social disadvantages and second-class citizenship for most African Americans living in the United States. Now, what that means is the Jim Crow laws made it normal for black people to be poorer, to have worse education, to not have a say in any kind of politics, and to just live worse lives. Black people became second-class citizens. They didn't have the same freedoms as white people. They were considered inferior, which obviously is completely unjust. Now, to make this worse, I have to introduce the fact that during the 1930s, the Ku Klux Klan were in operation. Now, as you can see from the images on your screen, it was a horrific time to be a black person. Those hooded white people were hiding their identity, but they would march through towns and they would march through villages, and their presence marching through town is a clear sign to any black people that we don't want you. You are not welcome here, and that when we can, we are going to remove you either physically or we will remove you lethally. The large cross there is quite clear that these people felt it was their duty to cleanse the world of people they felt were inferior. The Ku Klux Klan were prevalent in America at this time. They were incredibly frightening to their victims. Imagine how horrible it would be Crooks, living in constant fear that at any moment the Ku Klux Klan could come walking into the ranch to remove him. The Ku Klux Klan believed that white people were the superior race and fought for white supremacy over black people, and that type of attitude is clearly seen in Curly's wife. Curly's wife, one of the weakest characters on the ranch, still has more power than Crooks. And during the 1930s, they were responsible for a lot of horrific crimes. They tortured black people, they murdered black people purely because of the color of the skin. So in the 1930s, it's almost like being black was a crime in itself, which must have been horrific for people like Crooks. But if that wasn't bad enough, in the 1930s, it was quite common for people to create lynch mobs to deal out their own version of civil justice. A lynch mob, as you'll see on the left-hand side, is when a group of people come together and they have decided that a crime has been taken and that punishment must be instant. In lynch mobs, there is a sense of proud mentality where people don't really think about the laws of the land. They take that justice into their own hands and they deal out their own violent type of justice. It's more like revenge than any sensible kind of justice. Lynch mobs were gangs of men who took it upon themselves to impart their own form of justice on a black person who they felt had committed a crime. Very often, these so-called crimes were simple misdemeanors based on hearsay and gossip. Misdemeanor, a simple little crime. They haven't done anything massive at all. It's just a simple thing that if a white person did, it wouldn't be a problem at all. Hearsay and gossip, sometimes they didn't even know the facts, but it didn't matter. Because underneath it all, there was this assumption that, of course, black people have committed crimes. And even when no crime had been committed, lynch mobs would take the law into their own hands. The lynch mob would usually kidnap their victim, torture them, and then hang them from a tree. Incredibly dehumanizing type of justice. So when Curly's wife makes her threat, that is a really dangerous threat because a single word from Curly's wife is the difference between life and death for Crooks. The bodies were left to hang as a warning of what could happen to other black people if they did something a white person did not like. Now, lots of the characters in this book don't have a very nice future ahead of them, but none is more aggressive and violent and filled with hate than the future that Crooks could end up tolerating if he makes one single mistake. Of course, no essay would be complete without mention to the Great Depression. This whole novella is written to reveal how awful it was for the Great Depression, so you're going to have to mention it in nearly any context essay you write. On the left-hand side is a reminder that during the Great Depression and after the Wall Street crash, people lost their jobs and desperately went looking for work. We've talked in the past about how George and Lenny are itinerant workers or migrant workers. They have to constantly move around the country, desperately trying to find work so that they can look after themselves, so that they can pay their way. And that leads to people being far away from their family, and they don't make many friends because they're in constant competition with other people for those exact same jobs. On the right-hand side, you'll see that people during this time were starving. There was very little support for them, and it became awful for people's quality of life. During the Great Depression, racism was rife and got worse. And by the end of 1932, 50% of black Americans were unemployed. In some cities in the northern states, white people called for black people to be fired from their jobs due to unemployment in white communities. So think about that in terms of Crooks's position. Just by having a job would be seen as some people as selfish because it denies one of the other workers a job that they could do instead. And with such a surplus of workers, that would be a particularly horrible place for Crooks to be. Now, African Americans received less aid than their white counterparts and were sometimes not even allowed to use a charity soup kitchen. Crooks has no option at all. He is lucky to have a job, and he couldn't escape even if he wanted to. Now that we've recapped some of the important context, particularly for the character of Crooks, we're going to start exploring the text. Now, when we explore the text, I'm going to use any kind of page references from this version of the text, the one that I've used in class. As we go through some of these quotations, the racist slur that begins with N is used frequently throughout the book. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to use that word. It doesn't feel appropriate. So if I use the letter N, then you know that the term I've omitted is not omitted by Steinbeck. Steinbeck uses the term deliberately throughout. Now, as we're looking at the character, it's very important that you realize that John Steinbeck is trying to show us something. So Steinbeck isn't being racist by the terms and the phrases that he uses. If anything, he uses those phrases to expose the racism that was so prevalent in the 1930s. We're going to start off our analysis with the first mention of Crooks. We hear about Crooks before we even meet him. We don't see him properly until chapter 3. We don't really see him in much detail at all until chapter 4. And then he's almost not there at all in chapters 5 and 6. So let's take a look at the first time we hear about Crooks. First time we hear anything about Crooks at all is from Candy in chapter 2. And he tells us that when George and Lenny didn't turn up that morning, the boss got angry. He says, and he give the stable buck hell too. Now, what we can see from this quotation is that even though Crooks did nothing wrong at all, even though it wasn't Crooks who let down the boss, it is he who feels the wrath of the rich, powerful man. The boss, physically and verbally, abuses Crooks purely because of the color of his skin. Now, the term stable buck there very much establishes his status on the ranch. Stable buck is right at the very bottom of this hierarchy that we see on the ranch. In the same way that Candy's position as a swamper is to show very much that he's at the bottom of the power structure, Stable-buck does the same thing. We don't even hear his name. We hear the title, and the Stable-buck clearly is not worthy of any respect because he's on the lower echelons of this ranch. The second thing we are told is from Candy. He explains why the boss got so angry at Crooks. You see, the Stable-buck, sir. Can you see the racist slur that is used to almost explain that Crooks is deserving of his pain and punishment? We talked previously in the 1930s, it was almost like being a black person was a crime in itself. And you can see that the boss punishes Crooks purely because he is seen as someone worthy of punishment. It's almost whimsical in the way that Candy kind of doesn't think it's a big deal. He's quite happy to explain this to George and Lenny, two men he's just met. Now, Candy is happy to compliment him, and he calls him a nice fella too. But after that, he does something very important, and I think this is a deliberate choice by John Steinbeck. It says, got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. Boss gives him hell when he's mad. Now, knowing that Crooks has a crooked back, it begins to reveal why his name might be Crooks. The men on this ranch call him Crooks because they don't see a fellow human being. They have identified the weakness of Crooks, his crooked back, and they literally name him after his disability. And I think that's deliberate because in the 1930s, when people were traveling around ranches as migrant workers, they became quite mean because they knew they'd be moving on to the next job very, very quickly. So making friends didn't make sense. So the relationships that these men have are often very superficial relationships because they know they're going to move to the next ranch very quickly. So that superficial friendship ends up as superficial nicknames. If you know someone's nickname but you don't know their real name, you don't know them at all. And I think with all of the characters who seem to have nicknames, from Slim and Candy, Curly, their nicknames show that they're only ever seen as two-dimensional people. And for Crooks, he is just seen as a disabled black person, and they don't see the human being that's underneath the skin. The fact that the horse kicked him, this man has been damaged. Now, that could be something symbolic. Why is Crooks in so much pain? Yes, literally a horse kicked him. But the horse kicking him could be symbolic of his treatment by the world. The world has kicked him so hard, it has broken something inside of Crooks. And if you wanted to make that symbolic point, you're showing a true understanding of the text, and then you can link it to what it was like in the 1930s that showed that black people were treated in such horrific ways and it damaged them. Now, rather surprisingly, Candy tells us that he reads a lot. got books in his room. And again, I think this is a deliberate thing that Steinbeck does. The surprise in Candy's voice shows that it's almost unlikely that a black person at this time would be intelligent or educated. And because of the Jim Crow laws, there were segregated educational systems, and black people were not educated to the same standards of white people. But he reads a lot. There's also a reason why he might read. Now, we'll look at this later on when we get to the quotes of chapter 4. But he reads a lot. It's almost admired by Candy. But the reason why Crooks reads so much is because he has nothing else to do in the evenings. Whilst everybody else can play cards together, have fun, enjoy their company, he is isolated and alone, so his only way of escaping his own isolation is through books. There are a lot of deep things we can say about books, and I'll do those later on. But you'll also notice it says that he has books in his room. And the word his there, that possessive pronoun, shows that Crooks's room is not the bunkhouse. The men at the moment are standing in the bunkhouse, but he's excluded. Clear evidence that Crooks is segregated and held somewhere else because of the Jim Crow laws. Definitely worth mentioning in an essay. He then tells us about one Christmas when the boss did something he thought was very impressive. For the white men, he brought in a gallon of whiskey and gave it to them so that they could enjoy some time. For the black character, they did something a little different. So Candy says, "Yes, sir, Jesus, we had fun. They let the hen come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after the hen. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the hen got him. If he could have used his feet, Smitty says he would have killed the hen. The guy said on account of the hen's got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet." He paused in relish of the memory. Now, clearly here, the black character is dehumanized. He's not seen as a human being. He is seen as a source of entertainment. The only reason why they let Crooks into the bunkhouse that night is so that they could use him for sport. Now, in history, there used to be some past times that used to use animals in the same way. So, for example, bear baiting used to be when, for entertainment, some humans would capture a bear and tie the bear to a stake in the middle of a pit and then set dogs on the bear and then bet on who would win in that competition, whether the bear would defeat a pack of dogs or whether the dogs would kill the bear. In this case, we definitely have some remembrance of bear baiting. Crooks is used as an animal, and the men would bet on who would win, this character Smitty or the black character who was allowed in. Now, for Crooks, it was probably a pleasure just being able to go into the bunkhouse. They used him for sport. And if you look at the end of that quotation, Candy looks fondly back at that memory. For him, that was enjoyment. For him, that was pleasure. For Crooks, it must have been really dehumanizing. And all the way through chapter 2, there's a voice outside who's shouting for Crooks. "Stable buck! Oh, stable buck!" And then, "Where the hell is that goddamn?" Now you can see the instant anger that comes out of this character's voice. That instant anger shows that this black character should be at the beck and call of white people. He should instantly do what he's told. There's an element of expected compliance from the white characters. And again, that links into the context of what we've discussed. When Carlson comes into the room, one of the first things he does is complains about the fact that Crooks is too good at playing horseshoes. He says, "Jesus, how's that hen can pitch shoes." Slim compliments Crooks for his ability to play horseshoes. He says, "He's plenty good," said Slim. But for Carlson, watching Crooks being good at something is actually frustrating to him. He says, "Damn right he is," said Carlson. "He don't give nobody else a chance to win." And in that quotation, there's almost an expectation that the black character should let the white character win, purely because the black character should be inferior. And in Carlson's voice, there is some kind of tone of white supremacy. He's frustrated that Crooks is so good at playing horseshoes. Now, there's probably a reason why Crooks is so good at that game. The rest of the men, when they're finished playing, they'll go inside and they'll enjoy each other's company. They'll play cards and they'll tell jokes and they'll tell stories. Carlson and the other white characters have companionship each night. At least they get to go into the bunkhouse and spend time together. For Crooks, he is denied that companionship, that warmth, that humanity. So perhaps Crooks spends all of his time playing arbitrary games like horseshoes that means nothing. And I would argue that Crooks would swap his talent for horseshoes for just a single night of spending time with other human beings. The tone of anger in Carlson's voice again links into those themes of his hostility and brutality that we see on the ranch. In chapter 2, Crooks does appear. He does turn up, and he does talk to Slim, asking if Slim needs to come outside and to complain about Lenny with the puppies. In this quotation, take a look at how his actions are described. The door opened quietly, and the stable buck put in his head. A lean negro head, lined with pain, the eyes patient. Now, the way he moves into this room is he opened the door quietly, clearly not wanting to distress anyone, clearly not making an entrance, clearly protecting himself from any anger. If he burst into the room where he's not welcome, the men would get angry and put him in his place. So for Crooks, he has to do so quietly. Now, the phrase "put in his head" shows that he's too frightened to actually go into the bunkhouse because he's not allowed in there. Again, linking back to the mandated segregation laws of, the Jim Crow laws. Now, his head is described as lined with pain. Now, if we took that with a literal viewpoint, then we might say, yes, it's because of his bad back. But it's more symbolic than that. When we look at Crooks for the first time, we see pain first. And that pain, I would argue, is symbolic of all of the pain and suffering that he's been put through as a black character living during the racism of the 1930s. So lined with pain, I think that's symbolic of nearly all black people at the time who had to live lives as inferior creatures, as never being given the equality that they deserve as human beings. Where it says the eye is patient, I think Crooks has had to be patient in his life. He doesn't have the luxury of being impatient. He has to be patient because if he's not, people will put him in his place. And the first thing Crooks says is, "Mr. Slim." The word "Mr." there quite clearly shows the respect he gives the white character. Now, we know he does respect Slim, but I think the word "Mr." would probably be used towards any character, because the word "Mr." there places the white character in a position of superiority, and therefore he is a character who knows his place. He is the inferior, and he accepts that position because he can't fight against the hierarchy. He can't fight against the system. There's part of me that thinks Crooks has been beaten into submission, and there is a resigned tone in his voice. He's given up on trying to mean something. So when he speaks to a white character and he speaks to them with Mr., he does the same with Curly's wife later. He calls her Mom. He has accepted, and this is a phrase you could use in your exam, he has accepted his subservient position. Subservient means below, almost in a capacity where you have to do what other people say. Now, Slim says that he'll go and do what he needs to do, but Crooks offers to do it himself. He says, I can do it if you want, Mr. Slim. And Crooks is hard working. He's quite happy to do Slim's work. But Slim says, no, I'll come do it myself. And Slim is one of the very few characters that doesn't show any kind of racial hatred towards Crooks. And I think in this book we see Slim as this character that we're supposed to emulate. So perhaps John Steinbeck uses Slim to show that if we're going to have a better world, we need to fill that world with people like Slim and people like George too. If the world is full of Carlsons, then we're going to continue with this horrible Darwinian society where the strong believe they maintain their strength by beating the weak. Now, if we move on to chapter 4, we get to see inside Crooks's harness room. Now, please remember that Crooks lives in the harness room. He doesn't live in the stable and he doesn't live in the barn. That turns up in exam answers quite frequently, and it shows a misunderstanding of students. He lives in a harness room. Maybe the term harness room is important in itself. The word harness, a harness is something that ties up a horse. It's a lead, it's something that holds, that traps a horse. And harnesses are there for control. So perhaps the harness room could symbolize the fact that Crooks is also living under a harness. He is controlled, he doesn't have the freedom that he deserves. Now the harness room is right next to the stable. And it would probably be quite sensible to link the fact that he lives right next to the animals to the idea that he is treated like an animal. In chapter 4 it says, Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. Now deliberately we're supposed to see the segregation. The word bunk there means bed. All of the other men on this ranch are allowed to sleep in the bunkhouse, but he is deliberately denied access because of the Jim Crow laws. So instead, he is segregated into what is described as a little shed. From little shed, we can infer that he has no real comfort, no real warmth, no proper shelter, and he's just treated like an animal. And this is compounded with the imagery that we see in this next quote. Crooks's bunk was a long box filled with straw. Now that is the way an animal would be asked to sleep. And therefore, Crooks is treated like an animal because during the 1930s there was no equality between black and white people, and black people are seen as inferior, which means they're denied the types of powers that a human being should be allowed. We're supposed to feel sympathy for Crooks. You get a long description of what is inside Crooks, and I've deliberately not looked at the entire list of things because there is a lexical set of utility used all the way through that first page of chapter 4 when we find out all of the different things that he has in his room, mostly to do with work. But this quotation, and scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For, being alone, Crooks could leave his things about. And being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Now, the reason why I think this quotation is important is because it shows that Crooks has no way of escaping this ranch. If he genuinely thought he could leave this ranch and find somewhere happier, then he wouldn't have all of these things tying him down. For the other men on this ranch, they live out of bindles. And a bindle would be something that they would carry on their back so that they could take their possessions to the next place. Crooks has given up on escaping. And that's why he has possessions. Now, the word permanent there really highlights the fact that he is going to live this existence for the rest of his life. He is going to be trapped in this place. He has no opportunity to move on. And we've also got the description of his disabilities. He's a stable buck, which means he has no real value. and he is a cripple. And the fact that his disability is once again painfully labeled shows that he would not be able to get a job anywhere else anyway. Now, this quotation is perfect to link to context. Again, everything's got a link to context. It links to context because Crooks has no chance of securing employment anywhere else because of the surplus of available workers. And that's directly because of the Wall Street crash, which started the Great Depression. There are no jobs for him to go to. And then we get to the second mention of Crooks and his books. And he had books too. Now, the monosyllabic nature of the opening to this quotation shows there's almost a sense of surprise that this black character is both intelligent and perhaps educated. And it tells us that the books include a tattered dictionary. Now, if it's tattered, it means it's been well used, which means Crooks must be looking up definitions quite frequently if he's got a dictionary that's tattered. And if he's looking up for definitions, it's almost like he's trying to quantify things. He's trying to understand things in a little bit more detail, trying to perhaps find an answer in that dictionary that will contradict something that he's heard. And that links in with the last part of this quote, which is he also had a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. Now, mauled also means that he's constantly used it. It means almost broken in some way. He's mauled it so many times. He's looked through desperately trying to find something. Mauled and tattered creates that lexical set of being well used. And the fact that he's looking at the California Civil Code for 1905 tells us something I think very important. Now, first of all, he's reading California Civil Code because that's where the laws would be set out that would tell him what he can and can't do. Now, for Crooks, he knows that he does have some rights as a black person. He definitely has some rights, and he keeps going to that civil code, that law book, to show, look, I do have rights. Yes, I can be treated like this. Yes, I can. However, the California Civil Code is, at this time, about 30 years out of date. So he's looking at this book, constantly trying to deceive himself into believing that he can be treated as an equal. But in reality, he doesn't at all. And I think that shows that Crooks is desperately trying to find a world where maybe he can mean something. And this links into a wider point about his books. The reason why Crooks looks in his books so frequently is almost like a dream. He tries to find a world in books where maybe he can belong. He tries to find a law in that book that will show that this is unjust and that he does have more rights. Unfortunately, as we see on the ranch, nobody cares about the law at all. Nobody cares about what this book actually says, because that's not the type of world that he's living in. He's living in the hostility of 1930s America, which is Darwinian and hostile. So I think it's an important point there about the California Civil Code. Linking to the words mauled and tattered, we have now battered. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books. Battered again. Crooks is constantly reading, perhaps because he has nothing else to do, or perhaps he's looking for something. And the magazines that is mentioned here, they remind us of those old Western magazines where there are stories of heroes who manage to conquer unassailable odds. We have heroes who treat each other kindly, who win wars even though they shouldn't win them. Now, I would suggest that Crooks uses those books as a form of escape. Those stories are for him escapism, to escape the harsh, brutal life that he lives in. Maybe in those magazines, black people aren't treated so badly. Maybe in stories, people can see that black people are human beings. And the fact that he has a few dirty books, again, it shows us that he is looking for escape from his horribly painful life. And I think I would argue that nearly all of the characters on this ranch are looking for escape. For Whit, who also looks through magazines, he's reminded of a time when he had a friend. For George, he has this dream that maybe Lenny won't get into trouble all the time. Lenny has his dream of having his rabbits. Candy has his dream that maybe he will have a future for himself and he won't have to work himself to death. And it's only characters like Slim who seem to have given up on their dreams completely. And it's tragic to see someone as intelligent and wise and princely as Slim completely give up. Now, all the way through Crooks's description, we see him being cynical. It's these little flashes of him dreaming and hoping that I think shows us that, just like anybody else, Crooks just wants to be treated like a human and be allowed to have some company. And I think I'd argue that he is looking for a world with no Jim Crow laws to suppress the voices of black people. And then we come to this quote, which is, "The room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people kept theirs." And I think this quotation does two things. The start of this quotation, where his room was swept and fairly neat, I think that describes the fact that Crooks's house is hygienic and it's tidy, perhaps in juxtaposition to the way the men assume that he will live, animalistic and dirty. And the fact that he's a proud, aloof man, those two pre-modifying adjectives, proud and aloof. Proud means this is a man of dignity. And aloof is where we start to see that Crooks keeps people at arm's length. Now, what that shows is that he pushes people away. He doesn't want to get too close to them. I mean, we know that he really does want to be close to other people. But because of the pain that he has had to suffer in his life through constant racial abuse, he's now developed the characteristic where he'd rather hold people away than let people in, because he doesn't want to be hurt. He doesn't want to be disappointed. He doesn't want pain to enter his life any more than it already does. And it continues at the end of this quotation. He kept his distance. Now, the reason why he keeps his distance is because people have pushed him away. The Jim Crow laws demand that he keeps his distance and sleeps somewhere else. But he's now taken that into his own character and he pushes people away. And where it says demanded, there's an element of force there. It's almost like he forcefully pushes people away, even though he's not in control of that situation anyway. And when he demands that other people kept their distance, I think that's a man on defense. He doesn't want to be hurt any more than he already has been. And as a result, he'd rather push people away because people hurt him. Now, after the description of where he lives, we get the description of his physical appearance. And there are lots of details that are described that reveal perhaps a little bit more than just the character of Crooks, but perhaps the treatment of black people in the 1930s. First main description of him is his body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine. Now, I think there is some deeper meaning behind this part of the quotation. His body is physically deformed. We know it's because of an accident. We know it wasn't anything that he did. It wasn't anything that he did wrong. But either way, Crooks's body seems to be deformed in some way. Now, I think I would act that his physical deformity is due to the hardship and pain that he's been subjected to during the 1930s. Because I think his physical disability is more than just what's happened to his body. I think it's symbolic of his emotional pain. I think Crooks's personality has become slightly manipulated, slightly deformed, slightly ugly because of the pain and suffering that's been given to him throughout his life. And as it continues, it says, his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth seemed to glitter with intensity. The fact that his eyes seem to glitter with intensity suggests there is a real pain inside of his eyes, a deep well of agony. His face was lean and lined with deep black wrinkles. We've talked about the fact that his lined face seems to be lined with pain, further evidence to suggest that being a black person in the 1930s was an existence of intolerable pain. And that lexical set continues because he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. Now, the word pain, again, symbolizes the pain of black people during the 1930s, but the fact that that pain tightens his lips, I think it suggests that Crooks, as a black man in the 1930s, has had to learn to be very, very careful with his words. I think the pain that comes from those lips, it's painful suppressing your language, suppressing your thoughts, suppressing your voice. But Crooks has had to suppress his voice because one stray word could lead to a horrific amount of pain. With the Ku Klux Klan, like we've mentioned before, and lynch mobs, pain is waiting for Crooks as soon as he slips up. And as a result, he's learnt to keep his lips very firmly closed. When Lenny gets close to the harness room, there is a clear change in the atmosphere. What was a silent, quite solitary and lonely existence of this black man reaching behind his back and rubbing liniment into his skin. Then we get the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth champing on hay, and the rattle of chains. And there are lots of words there, lots of them onomatopoeic, rattle and champing, all suggesting movement and change. Now, the fact that there's a constant reminder of the sounds of horses and the sounds of feet and the sounds of teeth and the sounds of chains, again shows that Crooks lives with the animals, essentially suggesting that he is treated like one of the animals. But there is a change in tone as Lenny approaches. We then get the description of, in the stablebuck's room, a small electric globe through a meagre yellow light. And you've got imagery here of a man shrouded in darkness, desperately holding on to a tiny little source of light. And perhaps that tells us something about the 1930s. Crooks is surrounded by no hope, by futility, by darkness. And he is still holding on perhaps to one slight little bit of hope that maybe he means something, that maybe he will get equality, that maybe he has rights. Now that light is quite interesting because it looks like it is very, very close to being extinguished. He is described holding a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now, the physical bottle of liniment is his way of trying to alleviate his pain, and personally I think that that pain is never going to be lifted because I think it's more than physical pain. I think it's the emotional pain, the turbulence, the frustration, and the anger of being a black man in the 1930s. There is no solution to the Jim Crow laws that cause pain. There is no solution to the racism of white supremacists. There doesn't seem to be any pain. So whilst he is desperately trying to rub some medicine into the back of his spine, I don't think he's ever really getting much relief from it. Just like as a black man, he's not getting much relief of his existence. And the fact that with the other he rubbed his spine makes me feel really sorry for him, because I would imagine it's very difficult for him to reach that part of his spine that is causing pain. And ironically, if another worker was there, perhaps somebody else would be able to rub that medicine and actually alleviate some of his pain, because it's not medicine he needs, it's company. If somebody else were there, some of his pain might dissipate, it might dull slightly. And I think this quotation is quite interesting, and I think there's a few different ways you could view this. But his hands are described as pink palmed. And I think that's a really interesting description because on the outside, his skin is clearly black. It's described quite clearly. But the inside of his palms are pink. Now, if we were to think of any other characters on this ranch who would have pink palms, we'd probably say that George has pink palms, and Lenny has pink palms, Curly's wife, and Curly, and the boss, and Slim, and Candy, and Whit, and Carlson. They all have pink palmed hands. And I think that's Steinbeck's way of showing us that everyone is the same inside. Now, that's a really difficult thing to say. I'm not suggesting here if you have pink skin, you're superior in any way. But the fact that everyone would share a commonality, everyone has pink palms, I think that shows that Steinbeck wants us to believe that all human beings are equal. That underneath it all, we're all human beings. And I think that's one of the central messages of the entire text. So he has a pink palmed hand. After the description of his harness room, after the description of his physical body, we then see how he interacts when Lenny turns up. And it's incredibly sweet that Lenny doesn't seem to understand why people don't go to visit him, because Lenny's character doesn't see race. There is no hatred in Lenny just because Crooks is a black person. And that childlike innocence, again, is something that I think Steinbeck thinks we should emulate. We should all be like Lenny and see the person, see the potential friend, rather than the adversary that a lot of people would see. When he realizes Lenny is approaching, it says, on raising his eyes, he stiffened, and a scowl came on his face. And I think the words stiffened and scowl, I think those are defense mechanisms. I think the reason why he is angry when he sees someone come into his room is because Lenny represents all white people. White people to Crooks are synonymous with pain and cruelty. And Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come in my room." And the word sharply again shows that Crooks has to be on offense, because that's his best type of defense. The only way he can defend himself from pain is by pushing people away. Ironically, he doesn't want to be isolated, but being isolated is definitely better than being used as entertainment in a fight at Christmas. He pushes people away to protect himself. And I think it's really interesting when he says, "You've got no right to come in my room," because Crooks is obsessed with rights. That's why he's got the 1905 California Civil Code, because he knows the law. Crooks is desperately trying to hold on to any kind of right that he can protect, because as a black man in the 1930s, he didn't have much. He didn't have many rights at all. So he does have the right to push this man away, and therefore he's trying to exercise that right. He's clinging on to any kind of rights that he might be allowed. Lenny doesn't understand why people don't want him in the bunkhouse. Lenny doesn't understand racism, and he doesn't understand the Jim Crow laws. But Crooks says, "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." You'll notice that he repeats the word right quite frequently. And here he's telling Lenny, "No, I don't want you here." Now, the reason why, and it's in this quote, it says, "I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse." The fact that he is not welcome with the rest of the white men has turned him bitter and angry and frustrated. And I think Steinbeck is making a wider point about the 1930s and about the Great Depression. When people are treated badly, they end up treating other people badly too. And it's something mentioned by George and something mentioned by Slim. People get mean. When you're treated with hostility, you eventually become hostile. And I think that's happened to Crooks. He has to explain why he is treated so badly to Lenny. And his explanation is, "'Cause I'm black." And look how short a sentence that is, and look how monosyllabic it is. "'Cause I'm black." That is the reason why he is treated so badly. It is something not of his choosing. It's something that is completely arbitrary, the color of his skin. Because I'm black, and there is one thing that Crooks can't do, is change it. It's nothing about his personality. It's nothing about who he is. It's simply because of the superficial color of his skin. And then we start to see some of the reasons why Crooks is so frustrated. They play cards in there. And I can't play because I'm black. Now, I think the playing of cards is symbolic of company, companionship, and brotherhood. Crooks is denied any form of human interaction. And it's the one thing he wants more than anything else. But like it says, I can't play because I'm black. Now it then gets worse. The men say I stink. Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me. Now the fact that they say he is stink is clear racial insult. But it's an assumption. It's because they see him as an animal. We've seen inside his room. We know it's swept. We know it's clean. We know it's tidy. So these men are prejudiced against him. He doesn't stink at all. They believe he stinks purely because the color of his skin. It's almost like his race is a cloud that surrounds him, and that's all that the men can actually see. And as a result, he acts the same back to the white men, and he says, "You all of you stink to me." And again, the word stink there, I mean, the idea of racial prejudice is a disgusting stench. But it's something that Crooks will never be able to escape. He'll constantly have people with those views all around him. He can't escape it. Now, after a little while, Crooks invites Lenny into the harness room, and we see two things. We see Crooks taunt Lenny quite horribly, and then also we see Crooks open up to Lenny and share a little bit about his past and share a little bit about a time when he was actually happy. Crooks scowled again, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. "Come on in and sit a while." Now you can see that the scowl is there as a defense mechanism, but Lenny's perseverance disarms him. So Lenny gets to move past some of those defense mechanisms, and eventually Crooks does allow somebody into his little sphere of protection. And we see him soften, mellow slightly. His tone was a little more friendly. And it's only Lenny that Crooks actually shares his past with. Crooks opens up to Lenny in almost a form of catharsis. Catharsis is an outpouring of emotion, and I feel like Crooks has bottled up his entire personality, all his dreams and hopes, and has shut himself down to everyone. But here he actually allows Lenny to see some of his aspirations and some of his past experiences. He says, "I ain't no Southern Negro." Now, it's important here to realize that the South of America was even worse than the rest of America. California was quite a liberal state. So as a black man, he was probably treated a lot better than he would have in the southern parts of the country, where they were really reluctant not to abolish slavery. "So I ain't no Southern Negro," he said. "I was born right here in California." And that's really important, because I don't think many of the other characters on this ranch were born in California. The other men are itinerant workers. They came to California for work. Because of the Wall Street crash, lots of people left cities and had to move towards agricultural businesses like this ranch for work. So they don't belong on this ranch. They're only there economically for money. In the same way as during the Great Depression, there was also the Dustbowl. Lots of people had to leave some states, like Oklahoma particularly, Kansas, because their farms were no longer as fertile as they needed to be and they couldn't make a living. So they moved to California. They came over as migrant workers. They displaced a lot of people. But if Crooks was born right here, that means he belongs here. This is Crooks's home. And look how he's treated in the place that he was brought up. It says, my old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. Now, when we hear that, we can almost hear George's voice of his American dream. Having a couple of acres, a little house, and a stove. Now, in the past, Crooks seemed to have been happy. As a child, he seemed to believe he had a future, this lovely place where he lived. And he tells us the white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them. In his childhood, Crooks was actually treated as an equal, as a fellow human. In the same way that Lenny doesn't see race, these children didn't see his race. And he tells us some of them was pretty nice. In his childhood, Crooks wasn't bitter, but his father was, because my old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that, but I know now. And I think it's really interesting that he starts off with this lovely description of these children treating each other as equals until the painful realization in adulthood. The reason why his father didn't like it was because those white children would grow up to be prejudiced, white, racist men. I think there's a real bitterness that that bubble of perfection in his childhood was pierced so cruelly. I think this quotation shows his isolation, the fact that he is now completely alone. There wasn't another coloured family for miles around, and now there ain't a coloured man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad. We could link this to the 1930s. With such a surplus of available workers during the Great Depression after the Wall Street crash, perhaps some of those black people lost their jobs so that those jobs could go to young, able-bodied white men instead. People who belong in this place have been ousted by people who were there to take their money. After opening up to Lenny, Crooks starts to realize that Lenny isn't really listening, and Lenny doesn't really have the mental capacities of the other men on the ranch. He senses weakness. For the first time in his life, he meets a white man that perhaps has less power than he, as a black man, has ever had. And he takes delight in using it to cause Lenny pain. And he says his voice grew soft and persuasive. S'pose George don't come back no more. What'll you do then? Now this is where we see a cruelty in Crooks, and I think he wants to take revenge on white people. What he wants to do is to make Lenny realize how painful it is to be isolated and alone. He wants other people to feel his pain. And I think Steinbeck wants to show us that if white men felt how Crooks did, they wouldn't continue with the way they treat black people. And Crooks is incessant. It says Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. And that private victory, I think, is him feeling like he has power to hurt a white man because he's never had that power before. Just suppose that, he repeated. There's almost a sick pleasure there. And the last quotation, Crooks's face lighted with pleasure in his torture. He's been treated badly his entire life. He wants somebody to realize just how awful it is to be treated in that way. And then Crooks shows us that Lenny has a very difficult fate in front of him, in the same way that Crooks has a very difficult fate. We know that at some point Crooks is going to get sacked. Just like Candy, he's going to get sacked. He is physically weaker than some of the other men. He has a disability. His black skin is also treated as a disability. He knows that the future ahead of him is bleak. During the Great Depression, there was very little social security or support for black people. All it would take is for him to lose his job and he would be destitute. And a very, very painful existence lies ahead of him. So he shows Lenny what would happen to him. Crooks bored in on him. Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar, like a dog. Now, the booby hatch here is an insane asylum. Lenny's future, if he does anything wrong, if he's on his own, is that he will end up in a place that will be uncomfortable and painful for him. And the simile used here, tied up with a collar like a dog, I think that also links to the fact that Crooks is almost treated like a dog, with a collar around his neck, the collar of servitude, of subservience, of working for a white man who doesn't respect him. There's no mistake here. The collar and the harness, I think, are very similar pieces of apparatus. But very quickly, Crooks realizes the pain he felt over Lenny was a complete fallacy. It's not real at all. Because Lenny, even though he is mentally weak, he is physically powerful, he still has the skin of a white man, he is actually more powerful than Crooks. So Crooks very clearly is one of the lowest in terms of status on this ranch. But he senses the danger in Lenny. Again, Crooks knows how to stay out of trouble. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. And that's Crooks's form of defense. He removes himself from situations. Him edging back is him backing down. And we've seen this in Candy already. Whenever the boss turns up, Candy shuffles out. Again, that's the same. Because Crooks knows he has to remove himself from situations because he will be treated badly if he steps out of line at all. To Lenny's frustration and anger and Crooks backing down, in quite a heartbreaking scene, Crooks explains how important company is to the human psyche. Without company, human beings break down and become bitter and twisted and malformed like Crooks has become. Crooks is one of the few characters on this ranch that actually understands why George spends so much time with Lenny. He realizes the thing is they're talking, or they're sitting still not talking. It don't make no difference. Crooks envies the companionship that George and Lenny have. And I think that's a wider point by Steinbeck. I think Steinbeck is showing us that in life, human relationships are meaningful, and to have companionship shouldn't be taken for granted. Now, Crooks is denied that. But so were lots of people during the 1930s. During the Great Depression, with men moving around the ranches constantly as itinerant or migrant workers, they became mean because they didn't have friends. The 1930s was a time of competition. People were competing, often willing to take less wages just so that they got paid at all. So there's a constant hostility, and that's why we see people like Carlson willing to bully Candy into killing his dog. And that's why you see Whit and Carlson get so excited when there's a fight going to break out between Slim and Candy. Everyone's in competition. Everyone is far away from the family that they have, and they become mean in their loneliness and isolation. Crooks tells us of his misery, his melancholy, his pain. He says, maybe you can see now. And I think that's clear evidence to show that the purposes of his being mean to Lenny was to make Lenny understand. Because Steinbeck is telling us sometimes the only way to understand someone's pain is to feel it yourself. And he tells us, you got George. You know he's going to come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him. And here you can see that the focus on books is back. And he tells us that books aren't any good. Books ain't no good. And that's because books don't offer real salvation at all. Just like a dream, you never actually get what's inside of them. They're only a fleeting escape into an imaginary world where things are better. And eventually, you have to come away from books and realize that the world itself is painful and frustrating. The 1930s was a very hostile time. He tells us, yes, he could play horseshoes all day long, and Carlson is frustrated with him because he's got all that time on his hands. But I think Crooks would swap all of that time on his own for a moment with some company, and he tells us a guy needs somebody. And I don't think that's just him telling us that he needs some company. I think that's almost a universal truth that Steinbeck is telling us. It's almost like a maxim, like a statement that applies to everyone. Human beings need human beings. People need company. Otherwise, they become bitter and twisted and mean, like the migrant workers on this ranch. Steinbeck tells us there are consequences for isolation. He tells us, I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. And that's where I think Crooks's pain is not just physical pain. His real pain is an emotional pain from a lack of human understanding and empathy and feelings of equality. Then we get this line, which I think is deeper than just a man looking out a window. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. I think the window there is a metaphor for freedom, for a better world, for a place where he might be able to belong one day. Because I think Crooks is desperately hoping that one day he will be able to escape his reality. When he starts talking about his past, he does so with nostalgia. His present life is full of pain, and yet he has memories where perhaps he was a little bit happier. The stable buck went on dreamily. I think the adverb shows that Crooks escapes his reality through memories and not just books. I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. Two brothers. They was always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed, all three. Had a strawberry patch, had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a sunny morning. My brothers would sit on a fence rail and watch 'em. White ones they was. Now, all the way through that quotation is this imagery of closeness, of being being in the same proximity as another human being, a place where you belong, a place surrounded by people you love. And I think for Crooks, just like lots of the other characters, they were happy in the past, and now they're living in the Great Depression. Their happiness is gone. We see this in Curly's wife. In the past, when she had these men who were flattering her, she was happy. She wants to go back to the 1920s, during the Roaring Twenties, when perhaps there would be a place for her, where she would be able to have some of the luxuries that they had in the 20s. For George, he wants to go back to his childhood, and he tells us about his grandpa's ranch with the pigeon that goes around the windmill. For Candy, he was happy when he was young and physically able. His dog was even happier in the past when it was a good sheepdog. But the 1930s have no potential for people like Crooks. Because Crooks has given up on any kind of happiness, when he hears about Lenny's dream, he is cynical. He looks negatively at it and he tells Lenny it won't happen. He says, I see hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of them. And that's quite true. Lots of people during the 1930s had the American dream, which was to escape the Great Depression, to escape the hardship of having to move around the country constantly working for people and not benefiting from their own labor. He tells us that every damn one of them's got a little piece of land in his head, and never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. Now, the religious phrase, just like heaven, I think is tragic, because it's almost like Crooks has resigned to the fact that there is no peace for him even in death. Nobody ever gets to heaven. He's lost any kind of hope for his life, and he doesn't even see any peace in his death either. Amongst all of his cynicism, he does actually have some respect for Slim, and he mentions this. He says, maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes 2-3 times a night. Slim's a real Skinner. He looks out for his team. And we know that the men on the ranch really respect Slim for his hard work and his evident talents. But I think the reason why Crooks respects Slim is because Slim doesn't treat him badly. Slim is kind to him. He gives him that little bit of company those 2 or 3 times a night. And as a result, he actually has respect for Slim. And I think Steinbeck's message is to be more like Slim. When Candy turns up, Crooks is even happier, and he seems to genuinely feel pleasure in having company in his small little slice of the world. Crooks hides behind that initial prickly defense. And the quotation from the text, Crooks said irritably, "You can come in if you want." I mean, the word irritably there is in pantomime. It's an act. He's not irritated at all. Because later, come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. And the conceal his pleasure with anger part shows that this is what Crooks has always wanted. Human beings to speak to him, to give him company, and perhaps to break up the monotony of his painful life. When Candy comes into the room, he compliments where Crooks lives, which feels a little bit strange considering how horrible his quarters are. He says, "You got a nice cozy little place in here," he said to Crooks. "Must be nice to have a room to yourself this way." Now there's a huge amount of irony here because Crooks is not happy in this tiny little room, and I don't think Candy would be either. Perhaps Candy feels like if he were to live out in the harness room, perhaps he'd be allowed to have the company of his dog and Carlson wouldn't have bullied him. But Crooks sarcastically replies, "Sure," said Crooks, "and a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell." I think that manure pile really shows us how dreadful his life is. Candy tells us that he's never really made much of a effort to get to know Crooks very well. He says, "I've been here a long time," he said, "and Crooks been here a long time. This is the first time I ever been in his room." And it shows us that segregation means that human beings are kept apart. And if human beings are kept apart, people aren't friendly. People see each other as adversaries. They don't get to know their fellow man. And Crooks said darkly, hinting at the really sinister motivations behind Candy not coming to his harness room, essentially because of racist laws like the Jim Crow laws. He said, "Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much." Nobody here but Slim. Slim and the boss. And it really shows us that he hates the fact that white people keep themselves to themselves and see him as something subhuman. Now, there are two people that come to his room. Slim, who comes to his room to help work with him, to look after the horses, to help him with his job. A positive figure, almost an angelic figure. And then the second, more sinister, and the boss. And I think that's sinister because we know what the boss does when he goes to see Crooks. He physically and racially abuses him. There are very few people like Slim, but there are lots and lots of people like the boss. We again see Crooks's cynical views, and he shows them to Candy when Candy talks about the possibility of escape. When Candy talks about the dream, Crooks interrupted brutally. Now, the adverb brutally suggests that Crooks wants to hurt Candy's feelings of potential freedom. Brutally means he wants to not just tell him it won't happen, but to destroy that dream. Again, he lashes out and wants to hurt people because his entire life he's been hurt. He says, "You guys is just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box." Now, the fact that he realizes they're going to talk about it a lot is because he realizes that that's the way ranch hands escape their troubles. They have these dreams and these little fantasies, and that makes their life a little bit easier. But he knows in reality that that simply won't happen. Because during the Great Depression, nobody wins. Nobody succeeds. The conditions are stacked against you and it's too difficult. Now, the end of that quotation is really quite sinister. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Now, the box here is clearly referencing a coffin. And he knows that Candy is going to leave in a coffin because when he gets sacked, there is no future for him and he will end up destitute. But I think he also says this quite brutally because he realizes that's his fate too. Crooks has no escape, and Crooks also will work there until he is taken out in a box. Then he says, "Yeah," said Crooks. "And where's George now?" "In town in a whorehouse." Crooks pierces that bubble, so no matter how optimistic Lenny and Candy are, Crooks is able to show them the foolishness of it. And it's something that we see in Candy's character quite a lot. Candy is so desperate for this dream to come true, he offers his entire life savings to two men he's only just met. Crooks can see that human beings during the Great Depression are actually quite horrible people. They're not to be trusted, and that's why he's so cynical. He doesn't trust George because he thinks George is taking that money and he's just wasting it on a different type of fantasy, on a different type of escape, by getting drunk and visiting prostitutes. Crooks can't see any kind of dream where anyone can be happy. But just for a moment, Crooks stops being cynical and perhaps believing that he too can gain a little bit of escape. And just like Candy, maybe he could go along with George and Lenny and share in their American dream. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. "I never seen a guy really do it," he said. "And I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land. But every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes." And I think the whorehouse there suggests that human beings give in to their temptations and they want to escape, in this case through physical intimacy with a prostitute. Or a blackjack, maybe their temptation is, perhaps I will get success, perhaps I will achieve my dreams by gambling, which I think we all know is not a viable way to really achieve what we want. And in the Great Depression, everything was stacked against you. But this is where his quotation changes. It says he hesitated. And hesitation there could mean that he starts to think differently. The hesitation could show a nervousness. And I think his tentative hesitation is because he's about to show vulnerability. He's about to ask for help. He's about to offer himself to these men. He's about to request some kind of leniency. And the ellipsis again show his nervousness. He's not sure if he's saying the right thing here. He's not sure. It's almost like he's defending himself from being optimistic. He says, if you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, he offers himself for free. He offers. He doesn't ask for any wage at all. He doesn't ask for any part of the building. All he says is, if you take me along, you get free labor. And he says, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. Crooks, for the first time in his life, is asking, can I come along, please? And I think that shows his level of desperation. Candy was willing to give his entire life savings to George and Lenny so he could go to this farm. Crooks is willing to offer his life to them. I will be in servitude for you if I can escape for a little bit. And he says, I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch if I want to. He tries to show Candy that he still has some value. Tries to show Candy that he means something. That he isn't just a disposable worker like the 1930s Great Depression turned human beings into. He tries to show that he is valuable. And maybe these characters are different to all of those other characters that he's met in his past. For a second, he begins to dream. Now that very cruelly is almost instantly pierced by Curly's wife turning up. When Curly's wife infiltrates his little dwelling, at some point he tries to ask Curly's wife to leave. And Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. That's a deliberately kind of aggressive and hostile thing to do, because Crooks has almost been lulled into a false sense of security. Because he's started to believe that maybe he won't be at this ranch forever, he gets this false sense of strength. And it says, I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a coloured man's room. And that's no worse than what he said to Lenny or Candy. But Curly's wife takes this as an opportunity to assert her dominance. Curly's wife threatens Crooks in a very sinister and ominous way. She says, she turned on him in scorn. Listen, she said, you know what I can do to you if you open your trap. Now, the way she says listen is incredibly derogatory. She looks down at him. She tells him listen is an imperative verb, suggesting that she is superior to him. He's inconsequential. He's just a black man. He's worth nothing to her. And then the deliberate racist term, instead of the name Crooks, tells us that that's all she sees. She just sees this inferior character, not even a human being. And when she says, you know what I can do if you open your trap, she knows how much power she has. She knows it is a single word that needs to be said before the men will form a lynch mob and they will murder Crooks. She's very aware that she has more power than Crooks. Now, after each character we meet, Crooks seems to drop further and further down in the pecking order. For a second, maybe Crooks was stronger than Lenny. That power balance was very quickly restored. For a second, we feel like, oh, he is going to defend himself from the attack of Curly's wife. And then very quickly he realizes, oh no, I am at the bottom of this hierarchical structure. He says to Crooks, I could get you strung up on a tree. It's so easy, it ain't even funny. And that's the sad part. She knows exactly what she can do. and Crooks knows it too. Crooks must live in constant fear of lynch mobs and the Ku Klux Klan. And that's why he lives in such a defensive way. That's why he turns himself almost into a personalityless human being. That's why sometimes he doesn't even pretend to be human. Because he knows that at a moment's notice, he could be completely obliterated from the earth. And Crook's way of dealing with this is to retreat into nothingness, to pretend like he's an inanimate object, and to bring in anything that can be hurt and to turn into almost an empty human with no personality. This is how he responds to the attack. Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. The adverb hopelessly there tells us that Crooks is very, very aware that he has no hope at all for the future. And when he drew into himself, what he does is he locks his real personality away under layer after layer after layer of armor and defenses. And what he does is he just buries himself. Because if he buries all of his emotions, then he can't be hurt. And it tells us that Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. The fact that he grows smaller is because he has no power at all. Curly's wife is exerting her power, and Crooks, as a result, seems to dwindle away into nothingness. And when it says he presses himself against the wall, it's almost like he's trying to be the wall. He's trying to be an inanimate object. He doesn't want to be a human at this stage. And the way he speaks to Curly's wife now is, "Yes, ma'am." He speaks very much like a slave when slavery was, before slavery was abolished in America. Ma'am is a respectful term. He treats her with respect as someone superior, and it makes him seem like he's accepted his position of subordinacy. And that description of Crooks is continued because Crooks reduced himself to nothing. We've got this imagery now of Crooks shrinking under pressure. Nothing shows that he's being completely stripped away of anything meaningful, and we can see him for what he is, a powerless character with no rights at all. And it says there was no personality, no ego. Crooks has become very, very good at pretending like he's not hurt, pretending he's not even there. And it says nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. He strips away all of his personality so that there's nothing there that will upset anyone, because everyone on this ranch has more power than him. The next quotation, Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything might be hurt drawn in. And this reminds me of how human beings react to any kind of danger. There are three ways that human beings will react when threatened. One is to fight. Crooks stood up. He was almost ready to fight and to say, "Look, leave." But that's clearly not appropriate because that will end up in his murder. There is to run away. But that's also not an option. He can't escape because he's trapped in servitude. He needs his job. He has nowhere else to go. So his only option really is to freeze completely, to protect himself, to curl up into a ball, metaphorically, and to protect any kind of vulnerability behind a stone wall. And that's why Crooks is so defensive. And that's why he's hostile to people when first meet him, because he pushes people away so that he can't be hurt. At the end of chapter 4, we see a really heartbreaking moment when Crooks withdraws his offer of joining them at this farm. Crooks seems to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. And then he says, I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man gotta have some rights, even if you don't like 'em. Crooks goes back to the way he was at the start of the chapter. Crooks reverts to this isolated, aloof man that holds people away because that's his only option to protect himself. And he stops Candy before Candy leaves. He says, remember what I said about hoeing and doing doing our jobs? Yeah, said Candy, I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. Crooks withdraws his offer because he realizes it's not possible for him. He once again gives up on any chance of hope or salvation or escape. And he reluctantly accepts his position as a tortured, melancholic, isolated, lonely man with no chance of escape. He has to tolerate it because there is no other solution for Crooks. So he withdraws his offer, easier to feel disappointment than to feel the pain of what happens if I tried. He's given up. Like lots of the men on the ranch, he has given up on any chance of hope. The final quotation to describe Crooks is, he fell slowly to rubbing his back. And I think it's interesting that the last time we see Crooks, he's doing exactly the same thing as the first time we saw Crooks. He was rubbing his back with his liniment at the beginning because he was in horrific pain. And at the end of this chapter, he resorts to rubbing his back once more to rub that pain away. Now, that cyclical structure shows that he is trapped in this cyclical routine of being hurt, feeling pain, feeling worthless, feeling isolated. And from that quotation, I would suggest that he realizes this is his fate. His fate is to tolerate pain until eventually he dies. And I think that's a really sad way to leave Crooks as a description, because it shows that he's completely given up on life. The one thing I think is strange here is that when he had company, he didn't rub his back once, because company made that pain dull for a little bit. He forgot that pain. So perhaps company is the real solution to his mental torture, but it's the one thing he's denied. The ranch we see in Of Mice and Men could be considered a microcosm. A microcosm is something small that can be used to represent all of society or a much larger being. So, for example, the small little community we see on the ranch can be seen all across America. And I think Crooks means something in that microcosm. Steinbeck uses that microcosm to show us that Crooks' pain is the pain of all black people during the 1930s. Crooks' feelings of frustration with segregation is because black people realized that the Jim Crow laws are unjust. Crooks' dream for equality is because people during the 1930s dreamt of one day achieving some kind of equality. So Crooks in this microcosm represents how black people were treated. And I think Steinbeck's main message is that black people need to be seen as human beings, treated equally, allowed to achieve their dreams, and not racially, verbally, physically abused. This leads us on to the last thing that I wanted to share with you. You might be asked in your final exam to write an essay exploring the character of Crooks and what he reveals about the 1930s. So here's an example of an essay structure. This is not a structure that you have to use. You can write this in any way you want to. This is an example of how you might start bringing points together under sensible titles or sensible paragraphs. I think if you have 40 minutes to write, 5 minutes of planning would be completely sensible. And in 35 minutes, you might be able to write 5 paragraphs. You're not going to be able to write 20 pages of writing, but 5 clearly well-structured paragraphs, I think, will get you where you want to be. So I would, of course, start your essay with an introduction. Of course, you wouldn't start it with, in this essay, I will. Instead, in your introduction, show me you understand why Crooks was invented in the first place. In your introduction, show me what Crooks represents, and make sure you link that to context. So if you said in your introduction, throughout Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, Crooks represents the intolerable suffering of all black people during the 1930s as they suffered the hardships of the Great Depression and the mistreatment of the Jim Crow laws. That is far better than just, in this essay I will. And then at the end of your introduction, you probably signpost your major arguments. So what I mean by signposting is you'll give a little hint as to the main sections or the main ideas you're going to share. So you could say, firstly, Crooks's mistreatment is indicative of how many black people during the 1930s suffered racism. His segregation into the harness room demotes him to an animalistic character who is treated as subhuman. And his momentary belief in the dream shows that he is desperate for escape. But the crushing reality is that, like many people during the 1930s, they could not escape their suffering. Now, that is the essay structure that I would probably use. The introduction, like I just kind of verbally modeled to you, signposted that those are the major sections that you're going to mention. As my first main paragraph, I think it would be sensible to show just how awfully he's treated in this novel. And while I do that, I'd probably link to the context that we've talked about, the Ku Klux Klan, the Jim Crow laws, the hardships of 1930s America. All of that would fit in there. Now, what quotes you use to support your points is up to you, but we've gone through loads of quotes that would be absolutely perfect for a section on his mistreatment. My big piece of advice to you is you can't write about everything. There's no point trying to write about everything. You'll waste all of your time and you won't get onto the unseen poetry later. But you can definitely write about some things in a lot of depth. My second main paragraph, third paragraph in total, would be about Crooks's segregation. And in that section, you can mention the fact that he's segregated to the harness room, linking those ideas about being treated as an animal. His loneliness, his isolation, his mental torment, the fact that he's become bitter, all of that could move into the fact that he's segregated, obviously linking to the Jim Crow laws as well. And then maybe a third main paragraph on Crooks's sharing of his past, of the nostalgia and how he was once happy, and perhaps showing his almost nervousness in asking to go along with the dream. And then his final rejection of the dream as he gives up on any chance of happiness. And how the last thing we see of Crooks is someone who has just completely given up on life itself. And then a final conclusion, reiterating those main points, I think would leave you with a really, really lovely essay that you could be really proud of. Thank you so much for watching this video on the character of Crooks. Hopefully it really helps with your revision, helps you understand that there are lots of interesting ways that we can link the character of Crooks to the context of what was happening in America at the time. I really hope this has been useful for your revision. I hope you do fantastically well in your exams. Massive good luck. Let me know how you get on.